So welcome all to the Newcrown podcast. I am Daryl, and I am back with another episode. This will be the Christmas episode and also the final episode of this season. Today, I have my special guest, our last year's co-host. Unfortunately, this year he's been quite busy doing master's degree and all that. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello everyone. I'm Phil, and as your host has just caught you up on, I was previously a co-host. I've been neck deep in a master's degree, and this is a master's degree in film, but it's actually in video games because video games as a field have been incorporated within film studies broadly, at
Mm.
least here.
So, like, why was it? What did you take that avenue instead of like pursuing film or like the film genre? Like, was
Right.
it more relating towards your own personal interest in video games, or was it like there's a correlation, but it's still video games, different
Right. It's
medium.
definitely a different medium, but what a lot of people find interest in within video games can often overlap with what some people enjoy about film. Um, and I grew up, like a lot of people in my demographics, really loving video games and film as well. They
Mm.
were both things that kind of were, part of everyone's collective consciousness, kind of part of our day to day growing up. And so I've always had a fascination for that world. And so after graduating from my bachelor's in film, I was looking to see like what would be a new avenue for me to pursue. Because after doing like working on film, but also studying it for like a couple of years, I was kind of curious to check out other avenues as well, branch out a bit, kind of diversify my fields of knowledge.
Mm. I'm
Um,
curious. 'Cause I was talking to Hugo about like video games because he was talking about how video games often inspired him to like inspired his scripts that he wrote and eventually directed. So I'm curious, like, what kind of genre of video games do you enjoy? Is it very much like the story based? Is it like Pac-Man, Pokemon or whatever, or is it what style?
I really tend to like action adventure games. I like role playing games. I like games where you're embodying something faced
Mm,
with an adventure. So
okay.
a lot of open world games kind of have that facet as well.
Mm,
There's a lot of things of that nature that I tend to gravitate towards, and often I like puzzles quite a bit. So I like having an adventure sprinkled with puzzles. For me,
mhm.
that's very enjoyable. And for me, those adventure types, they tend to also have a narrative that's interesting to me.
Interesting.
However, like prominent.
Is the story itself important to you, or is it more like a background thing?
It's quite important to me. I think I value it a lot. I think that story is a result of gameplay as well, to some
Mhm.
extent. Like having a narrative and then gameplay leading you through that
Mhm.
is going to kind of create also like there's a story that you're being told, like fully the
Mhm.
story that the game is giving you, but also there's the story that you're telling yourself while playing,
Mhm.
right? Which is like the story of how difficult it was to beat that boss or to
Yeah.
traverse that level or to do this. Like
Mhm.
there's the story we teach ourselves in a way.
So, what are your favorite games?
I'm very, very fond of the Legend of Zelda series.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm actually doing a master's thesis on it. I'm working a lot on Breath of the Wild that I find
Okay.
really revolutionary and interesting.
Okay.
And I'm also a fan of some of the older Zelda games. I grew up with Twilight Princess being one of the more narratively involved games
Mm.
in the series. I really enjoyed that.
So
And
Nintendo very much oriented.
yeah, yeah, it had a very strong tone throughout it. I really love that. I'm a big fan of The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. That's another
Okay.
game that
Yeah.
really connected with me. I really loved how the world was integrated.
Mhm.
For me, that's like a masterclass on how to deliver an open world.
Okay. So,
Um,
what are your opinions? What are your opinions on like? Well, first of all, open world. Are you talking about like a full open world, or are you talking about very much like? Because I'd say, Skyrim is like an open world. It's very much
yeah,
like open, but then you have also hybrids, if you will, kind of like God of
yeah,
War, where they're kind
mhm,
of you're limited. They don't allow you to exceed a certain realm, you know what I mean, or a certain
yeah.
space within the world. So I'm curious, do you like very open world where you could do everything, explore the whole world, or it's very much you like more limited, but still compact area to explore in?
Um, I like them both, but if I had to pick a favorite, I'm quite fond of having like a clear direction in front of me because it often
Mm,
allows for the story to be more involved from the get-go. You get to kind of have more scripted events.
gotcha.
But I do really like, for example, Breath of the Wild being nearly entirely open. It's
Yeah,
one of the most open world games ever made, I
yeah.
think. And yeah, I like that as well. So I guess I like them for different reasons.
Because I was thinking, because, for example, like for because I haven't played Breath of the Wild, but my understanding of it is very much like there is a open world, but first you have to unlock certain areas
Right.
as you adventure. Whereas, like, for example, Red Dead Redemption,
Yeah.
there's like there's a prologue where, okay, you're limited to where you're able to go, but then afterwards the whole world is unlocked to you.
Yeah.
Do you like that, or you prefer you being sort of oriented towards that part of the area at a certain period in the story? You know what I mean?
Well, I like the idea of progressively unlocking areas because it kind of makes it so that first area you're in
Mm-hmm.
becomes an area, but also a tutorial
Mm-hmm.
on how every area functions. So I find that pretty clever. So I quite like that as an
Mm-hmm.
idea.
Because when I was playing, like, what was it, Horizon Zero Dawn, for example.
Yeah,
So I believe in Horizon Zero Dawn, you can, like, to a certain point, you could like literally travel the whole world, even if haven't finished the mission. The only difference is like obviously your level. So
right.
that's why like enjoy that type of gaming, because like, yes, it allows you to explore everything and like the first like 15 minutes once you finish the tutorial, but there is a consequence, like a drawback, whereas
Yeah,
you're literally like, I say, like level 10, and you're facing like monsters like level 70 or something, and you get completely obliterated. So it gives you that kind of hybrid, that option to explore, but then you gotta like, okay, you gotta do it in a very sneaky way, whereas other games are literally barriers or whatnot that prevent you from cross paths, like crossing that area point. So
right.
um do you find like game mechanics to be something that are very, very important? Do you prefer games that are complex, that have like a lot of options, for example Cyberpunk, we have a lot of different gimmicks and all this and stuff, or do you prefer the simplicity in video games, where it's like you're limited to a batch of moves, a batch of like stuff to do, like like
Mhm.
you're customizable, like your character's customizable, but to a certain degree.
Right.
But then, do you prefer that, or do you prefer like max out, do all these gimmicks? Because I don't know, I feel like having a limited box of what you can do forces you to be creative and
Yeah.
what you could do with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, when you have a preset of options,
Mhm.
each of these options can be a bit more meaningful probably. They get more development time, they get to be a bit more thought out to give you like a meaningful experience. So I do like when there's some restraint,
Mhm.
but I understand the appeal of having, a whole slew of things
Yeah.
to custom the experience. I understand that too.
So, like, from a master's degree standpoint, like, what have you found that kind of that consumers enjoyed about the video games per se? Like, what did you learn about the video games, the video industry, but also the game
Yeah.
types that are very much um like active and are very sort of prominent throughout the history?
So something I learned about consumers is that there are two like broad views on video games that have dominated the space for the longest time,
Mm.
which has been the debate on like, is the video game meant to be a story device? Is it meant to
Okay.
be focused on story, or is gameplay the only thing of importance? And what is truly the winner between those two big
Mhm.
forces in video games? So some people really tend to gravitate, and this is actually a majority, I believe, at this point, of people who prefer the story angle of a game. So for
Okay.
them, like a lot of genres for games end up still being defined by what is the coat of paint
Mm,
on the thing rather than purely what are the gameplay mechanics, right?
interesting.
So if you're looking at God of War and then you look at, I don't know, maybe the latest Spider-Man game or Red Dead 2,
Hmm.
they have some very similar traits. They are
Hmm.
all from a similar gameplay genre,
Hmm.
but they aren't being compared so much because they have an aesthetic and a representation that is like very different from, like a film genre
Yeah, yeah,
perspective, for
yeah.
example, way we typically see genre outside of games. So in a way, gameplay is not the only thing that affects genre to some extent,
Interesting.
and aesthetics play a large role in how consumers adhere to like a game or a product, if you want to call it that.
Interesting.
Like God of War has like a whole aesthetic running through it
Hmm.
that plays into its gameplay dynamics. So
Hmm.
gameplay is also, that's my take, but gameplay is also enforced by narrative.
Hmm.
So that means that like there's a whole half of the audience that really cares about story first and foremost, and
Hmm.
for them the gameplay is just a means to go through the story, right? On the other hand, you've got this whole audience that says no, it's just about the gameplay loop.
Hmm.
And so in the purest sense,
Hmm.
it's like, can I clear Pac-Man at level
Hmm.
20, let's
Yeah,
say? Like, can I create a gameplay loop that's really fun
yeah.
and just trim down on that, right?
Mm,
So there's different audiences, and those two poles have kind of been at odds with each other for a long time now.
mm.
But it seems like we're kind of progressing into kind of a middle ground where
Interesting.
we're understanding that a visual story doesn't have to purely be cinematic,
Hmm.
although cinematics definitely play a role in the history of games.
Yeah.
Um, Cutscenes, that is, but we also have like new ways to tell stories through video games, through gameplay, and
Yeah.
that's super fun.
I think Call of Duty has the best kind of rounded out kind of mechanic because it gives you the option of the story mode, which is like the
Mhm.
campaign, but then it keeps also the competitive aspect of the Pac-Man esque game where you go in multiplayer or in zombies, right? So
Sure.
like you're literally going up against rounds and rounds, and how many rounds can we do, and how many, like it's. I feel like the thing is that I feel like the people who gravitate towards the story value immersivity,
Sure.
whereas the latter would be more towards competitiveness. It's like if I could beat my own record. It's like it's like those carnival fair games. Like you gotta hit
Yeah.
the hammer. You gotta like those type of games. I feel like they're much more like you know exercising like the innate ability or the innate desire to be like I could beat my last score. It's like a pump out workout. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
But
There's kind of a you versus the system,
yeah, it's like Rubik's
game
cubes or something like
system.
that. It's you against yourself, like type of mentality. Whereas the opposite is more like these people prefer to like immerse themselves in, I don't know, an hour, 3 hours, 25-hour gameplay where they get to embody a different character and allow themselves to fly, and I guess it's a form of escapism. So I'm curious, like, well, first of all, what was it like doing a master's degree, and what is the difference between like masters and a bachelor's?
Right. Um, what it's like, I would describe it as you're starting to see the behind the scenes of what is teaching and what is learning. You're trying to like go through the veil of just taking classes and
Mm,
you end up kind of stepping really into the academic world more.
okay.
Um, so how I would differentiate it from the bachelor's is the bachelor's you're taking classes, right? You're
Mm,
here to be taught
mm-hmm,
by someone with valid experience, a subject, a very limited portion of a subject, or a very broad overview, right? It's either very specific or very, very broad.
mm-hmm,
Most of the time, it's the broad thing. Um, then in the master's, you're taking seminars, which aren't the same, where as instead of just receiving information, seminars are more like a sit down talk where, you're like a limited amount of people, small
okay.
groups, and you're all sitting around a table. There's usually like less of a front of the class, and it's more just, in a
Mm,
circle shape, and we're all just talking about a subject while the teacher is there to kind of keep
mediate.
us on track, to
Yeah.
implement, to kind
Yeah.
of moderate it, and
Mm-hmm,
to feed us food for thought, right? He
mm,
either challenges or proposes avenues to think about certain things. And meanwhile, we also have to practice, talking about the subject, and we have to practice our understanding of it by, writing huge papers. So, yeah, that's
do you enjoy that? Do you enjoy that aspect of academia where you have to write countless pages and pages and pages of a theory?
not always. Um, I'm learning more and more that a lot of teachers who work in the department have a strong preference for one or the other. Like they either really like the research part or
Hmm.
they like the teaching part.
Hmm.
And so some of them are like, yeah, I'm here for the teaching part. That's the part that really lights me up, that makes me excited to communicate with young thinkers, people that will, create their own theories, people that will have their own kind of ideas.
Hmm.
And then, there's some people that are like, I want to make my own research and I want to like establish theory. I want to test something like that. That's super exciting too. But, some people have a preference. And
So what do you
I say
gravitate? What do you gravitate towards?
right now, I'm really liking the teaching portion
Interesting.
because
Okay.
it's fun because there's a human contact there that isn't so present when you're doing research. When you're doing research, most of the time you're really alone. You're really like on your own reading things, and then you're like creating a whole like database of everything you've read and the useful info, and then you kind of line it up and you end up writing that alone in your room. Meanwhile, when you're teaching, you're talking to people and you see. I mean, I'm lucky. It's a field that a lot of youthful people are interested in because it's our generation.
Hmm.
Um, Video games really stimulates a lot of people in the classroom. So when you talk to them, you see the light in their eyes, you see the passion, you see the drive to like get involved with it.
Hmm.
So that's really fun.
Do you
It's
teach? Do you teach other people from that are doing masters, or teaching other people who are like in bachelor's degrees?
so currently as a TA, I correct and I also sit in for bachelor's level classes.
Okay.
Um, I know that it's possible to kind of do so at higher levels as well. But currently, that's what I'm doing. I'm basically overviewing students that are barely like 2, 3 years younger, maybe. So that can be kind of a funny feeling to be like correcting and to be like giving advice to people that are like not that much younger than me,
Yeah.
but it's an interesting process and it's rewarding. It's very, very rewarding because like I just came out of correcting a lot of midterms
Mm,
recently. It was a whole bunch of them. Our classroom is a bit over 100.
Okay.
So there's me and another TA. So
You
we're
correct
splitting it
you 50-50.
about.
Like, are you guys correcting like pages and pages of essays, or like what? How does it? What is it?
Yeah, so we correct pages of essays. So how it works is we get all the essays, we get them in. We have we create our own documents where we kind of slot them in, and then we grade them one by one. We put notes in.
Mm,
We have the correcting instructions already delivered to us by the teacher themselves.
mhm,
And we're just there to kind of grade every. Well, that's how we proceed, right?
mhm.
Every teacher and TA can arrange themselves differently. They don't have to do what we do.
Yeah.
So I only speak for my case.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, so we correct them all. These were about approximately 5-page papers.
okay.
Some of them more, obviously. But we go through them. Okay, we read them all, correct them, and we do all 50-ish of them. And once it's submitted, you're kind of your hands are clean. You're done for a bit,
Yeah.
and then the next exam comes in. Yeah,
How thorough do you guys actually correct it? I'm curious, like especially
yeah.
as someone who was trying to do a bachelor's. I was like, I'm curious how nitpicky and how meticulous they are with correcting. So I mean, for you especially, like, I guess you can't speak for other people. But for you, how like very like what are you looking for? Are you looking for the ideas? Or is there very are you doing it very much like word for word as the rubric states, or are you kind of like putting in your own interpretation of what perhaps the student is trying to say?
I try to be very generous with trying to understand what the student is trying to say.
Hmm.
But I'm also very prone to just following the rubric one for one.
Okay.
So if the rubric says cite twice, you
Yeah.
got to cite it twice.
Yeah.
If the rubric says explain your ideas and how many points you're getting out of that, if it makes sense, you're getting all your points. If you don't contradict yourself, you're getting your points. Like I don't think that it's necessarily a bachelor student's job yet
Mm-hmm.
to impress me so much to earn all their points.
Gotcha.
If what they say is sound and they've done the work and I feel like they've put enough effort, I'm rather generous, I believe.
Nice.
But that's because I think we have to be generous to students because they're going through a lot. They are taking a lot of classes. They're also like we have to be generous because sometimes we are going to perceive how they think a
Hmm.
certain way.
Hmm.
We have to try and like be objective. And so, by taking the rubric is our source of objectivity, I
Hmm.
suppose. So I like to stick to it very much and just try and not assume too much
Hmm.
about what students are implying. But if they do, I still will inform them because I write notes at the end of all of my corrections. I don't know if all TAs do so, but I know that I really care about giving them a positive and or something to improve.
Oh, yeah, like a critique.
Yeah, a
And
positive and a negative, if you will.
gotcha.
And so I tell them, you did this really good. You should do this more, or you should improve. And I do this no matter how good or bad the paper is.
Hmm.
I like everyone gets a plus and a minus, no matter what. So if your paper is 10 out of 10, let's say you get 100%, I'm still going to write in the negative, this is interesting. You could consider looking more into this
Mm,
subject that you
gotcha.
mentioned, like just
Mm-hmm.
a road to follow up on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because even if your paper is perfect, that's a great starting point to
You can still
keep going,
improve. Yeah, you can still improve. Yeah.
or at least there's more in the field to
Yeah.
dig into, right? And even when it's not a paper that gets a super high grade, I still try to look into the paper for what like strength I can see. Like sometimes there's a paper where let's say, doesn't follow the rubric that well,
Yeah.
but they still handed in something where it can kind of tell that it's like, oh, you really looked into that game you were talking about. I couldn't give points simply for being interested in the game you're talking about.
Hmm.
But I'm at least going to let you know in the notes as
Hmm.
a positive that clearly you have either an understanding or like a deep care for what you're talking about.
Hmm.
And that's worth something, at least to let them know in the notes, right? Because I want them to understand that I really did read through each and every one of their papers. I think it's important for students to know that we are considering them because it makes them feel more considered and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
they'll do better, I
Give some
think.
validation at least. Yeah.
Yeah, if they have the validation, they might feel more inclined
Yeah.
to, put their all, right?
Has there been a case? Has there been a case where the TA, maybe not for you, but like, have you seen or a TA and the teacher kind of disagree on a particular paper, or is it like, does the
Yeah.
teacher even look at the papers as a as a read through, like to make sure that the TA wasn't just like leniently giving them points, or like maybe being too strict on the student?
So often the TAs will just ask questions to the teacher because we have meetings
Mm-hmm.
between teachers and TAs every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those meetings, we tend to, for example, ask just point blank, hey, I was correcting this copy and this person wrote this. How do you feel that is worth? Do you feel that that deserves to get half a point, the full point? And then sometimes the teacher will say, well, I believe that this would be this, but ultimately it's in our hands. As
Mm-hmm.
TAs, we are correcting. So the teacher, at least in my case, trusts us a lot and gives us kind of the leeway to make the calls in these
Gotcha.
cases. But, sometimes a TA says, oh, I think this is worth like half a point. And the teacher says, well, that's generous. I would have said zero,
Mm-hmm.
like that can happen.
Yeah.
Um, but maybe not in the way I just said it, obviously.
I mean,
But
it could. I could. I mean, like, if for example, if the teacher and the TA would have a difference on opinion of I guess particular game, I don't know. I like, it's always, there's a lot of subjectivity in it anyway. So it's like when you read the thing, for example, if there's a game that you really like and the person touched on particular subjects that are you deem prominent, but then the teacher be like, yeah, but there's a lot more other things that they could have touched on, and maybe they weren't like touching on those points as much, like
uh, funny enough, we don't often discuss the subjects that the students choose to write on.
oh, interesting.
We're more talking about like the person quoted this but didn't like insert a quote. It's
Oh,
kind of
okay, okay, gotcha, yeah, yeah.
I would say it's more objective than it
Mm.
seems because the subjective part is simply like what the student has decided to talk about
Mm-hmm,
and what they chose was interesting enough to talk about, right?
mm-hmm,
But when we're like making the more finicky calls, the more like the trickier stuff to grade, it's often just like, oh, the student uh, cited one author, cited them once, and didn't provide a
source,
source
yeah,
in the bibliography, for example.
fair enough, yeah,
Like, what's the call? What's our policy? And so it's more objective than it seems.
yeah,
Because when it's like, oh, this person decided to talk about Red Dead, but didn't mention traversal even once.
yeah.
Well, we're not often talking about stuff like that
But even,
because
but don't you guys have like of a topic, like for example, I don't know, midterm
yeah,
or other, there's like a specific type of thing, a subject matter that you guys address in class or whatnot, and that that subject matter, they want the students to kind of mention it at least once or twice
yeah,
and talk more about it. So yeah, like in those cases, like I don't know if, like for example, character customization, if that was like a thing that was talked about in class, like if
sure,
if the TA were to say like to a teacher like, oh, maybe yeah, they've addressed it, but they didn't really talk about I don't know, psychological impacts or this, that, and the other may have brought onto the consumers. I don't know.
From my experience, I don't think that discussion would happen.
Okay,
Like I feel like the TA would choose on their own,
gotcha.
where they would, see the information and just grade if it fits with the rubric.
Mm,
And if like the main theme, let's say, is character customization, well, does the intro bring in a question to do
mhm,
with character customization? And does the conclusion bring us through what the text has,
mhm,
argued something about character customization,
mhm.
right? So as long as it has that presence, it's there.
Okay.
Then it's, like checking how they're arguing this
Yeah.
for their sources. And, like sometimes it's a lot about like how the student approaches, citing,
Yeah.
how the student um, structures as well. Like I've read a lot of essays up till this point where a lot of it was conceptually very well argued,
Hmm.
but there was maybe a lack of structure in the ideas.
Gotcha.
So it can be like confusing to read.
Hmm.
So when something like just flows, you can kind of sense it.
Hmm. So how important is the diversity of the sources? Because I know, like,
Right.
for obviously, like, big Wikipedia and what them, they shouldn't be considered. But I'm saying, like, for example, if a subject calls for the research of a particular company, or like Nintendo, whatever, and then and then
Yeah.
and then the person were to cite very specific things, but they're very much like, I don't know what the structures of the essays may be. I don't know if they're kind of argumentative, but if they are,
Yeah.
for example, they don't choose a good source to refute their main idea. Like, how
Right.
would does that matter to you? Is it the type of sources matter to you? The type of you know what the sources bring into it, or is it just as long as they've followed the rubric? And,
So what the source is does matter to some extent, but not in the way that one might think. If your source is somewhat academic, that is to
yeah.
say, it's like it's a officialized publication, it has academic legitimacy. That
Hmm.
means that you can't use IGN as a source,
Yeah.
unfortunately, because IGN is journalism. So it's going to have some inclinations that won't be based on research, right? So what you're using as your sources has to be research based, which
Mhm.
means it's academic. So those are the sources that will get you your points in the rubric. But I've seen and read some essays where there was academic sources,
Mhm.
and they were also complemented by more journalistic or more like less academic sources as well, to
Gotcha.
kind of sprinkle a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's fine. Like that's not going to lose you any points. It's just that you have to cover your bases. So
Okay.
the
So
basics,
you allow for more
sure, like the
add-ons.
basic of your argument has to be based on a strong foundation, right? It's like a bit of architecture. You're kind
Yeah.
of having a strong foundation, which is other people have researched what you're researching.
Hmm.
And so you base yourself on this foundation that's established, and you can prove that it's a very strong foundation.
Hmm.
And you try to build on that.
Hmm. And like, whatever you use to build on that is not that important in terms of, like,
Well, it's your
how's.
words
Yeah.
using the words that have
Of
been
other.
used before,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But
But the sources themselves, like, for example, if they want to talk about, like, I don't know, the review of a film, of a game, they could take, like, a
yeah,
publication of, I don't know, a video that IGN like publicized.
yeah, yeah, definitely. If you're talking about reception, you can definitely take an example from like a publication like that for sure.
Okay, cool. So,
Yeah,
moving on to more filmography ish avenue.
yeah,
Recently, like, I think currently you're also, like, editing a film that you and
yep,
another subject guest of mine, Hugo, was working on, was it beginning of this year? No, was it summer of this year, right?
Yeah.
So as someone who also directed and co-directed the film, I don't know if you want to talk about the film itself, but like what was your experience like working with another director in terms of
Right.
making a film? What were the challenges and how you kind of like contoured those
Right.
challenges?
So I really enjoyed co-directing because it allowed me to have more hands on deck with
Mm,
what we were trying to do. Um, because as a director, I know that I have a strong focus on the story being told, and so with dialogue, with acting,
mm,
and the writing, that's like things that really matter to me.
mhm,
And so I know that I tend to hone in on that when I'm like directing. And the co-director that I sought out to co-direct with has a strong visual uh, sense of directing. It's very much like his preferred avenue to like hone in on is the visual presentation of the image, right?
mhm,
So as these two kind of different kinds of directors that we all have like a sense of the basics of everything. Like
mhm,
you still have to understand everything around you as a director,
mhm,
but also, we all have specificities. We all have something we pride ourselves in,
mhm,
something we kind of hone in on. And for us, it tends to be we had very complementary ideas and complementary ways of working. So it
mhm.
just so happened to like really work well at like two puzzle pieces
Working
falling into place.
matching perfectly. Yeah. So like,
Yeah,
what was the process like of pre-production? Because he was talking about essentially, because I was asking him the question like, how did you kind of not fall into a disagreement while production? And
sure.
Hugh was talking about essentially you guys discussed a lot of things prior to filming, and a lot of the ideas, a lot of the themes, the essentially the aesthetic of the film. So I'm curious, what was the conversations like? Are you guys? Because I know from working with him, he's very much, he's very meticulous, and as someone
Mhm.
who's on theater, you have that kind of same structure where you're kind of meticulous, but you also like know improv. You're very much like a
Yeah,
performance oriented director. So I'm curious, like, what was the conversations like, and how do you guys
yeah,
kind of agreed on particular things, notably the aesthetic and et cetera, themes?
yeah. So how it kind of worked out was it was a script that I wrote, and so I ran it by him,
Mm-hmm.
and he manifested the interest in wanting to uh, work on it. And we would meet up, and I would kind of go on about like how thematically, how visually I could imagine it,
Mm-hmm.
and how the parts of the story were meant to interact with one another, and how the whole mechanism of the thing was meant to function,
Mm-hmm.
and what it was trying to do of sorts. So with setting that up would kind of give him leeway to kind of introduce his own method to it, his own like ideas of
Mm-hmm.
like what kind of visual cues would be interesting, and for us to kind of talk and hash out if it fit the vision that had been described previously.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a game of guess who, kind of like we're checking like, okay, does it have these traits?
Yeah,
Do these match?
yeah,
And seeing like what the essence of the project should translate
yeah.
into. So there's something very like there's almost a game to it of sorts.
Was there an
of
aspect? Was there an aspect of the film that you guys kind of had a harder kind of agreeing? Like you guys found kind of, I guess, were different. There's like, I don't know if there was like maybe how you want to film the scene or like what kind of mood it was. Was there like an aspect of the film that you guys kind of disagreed on prior, and then slowly kind of okay, maybe you could try this, maybe you could try that, or was it very much smooth sailing from the get go?
There was one line, a specific line that was proposed that for some reason I didn't agree in my very meticulous dialogue perspective
Yeah,
how it was integrated. And so we had a conversation on how it could work. And so I made a rewrite trying to fit that into the mold of what my kind of mindset would allow.
yeah,
And so I kind of passed the idea through. I tried to kind of spin it around and get a look at it. And by kind of working around it, I kind of figured out there is something here. There is something that fits with the original that doesn't like change it
yeah.
from like the soul of what I had put in.
Hmm.
And so I could turn this into another thing. I could
Hmm.
turn this into something that works. And so it wasn't so much of a big disagreement. It was more me being very, very hands-on with
Gotcha.
every single line,
Line.
wanting it like it a certain way. But as you stated, I also want to be able to permit some level of leeway of breathing in
Yeah,
a natural way into it.
yeah,
So yeah, there is something where there's a very meticulous structure, but then wind will pass through it.
yeah.
There will be something more natural that will wash through it and giving it an additional texture.
What was your experience like directing a film you're acting in? Because you've done it another time,
Yeah,
but because I've done it once. Yeah, we come in. I've done it once, and it's interesting because you have to trust everyone
yeah,
else, but because now you have another director to help you out. Was it a lot?
yeah.
I'm guessing it's a lot easier, right? So it was. What was your experience like from the get go, from when you first started, and then like the second half when you did the co-directing?
Yeah. So when I started uh, acting in films I direct, um, it was very difficult. There was kind of a having one leg hanging over a ledge kind of feeling. Like you're standing on one end, but there's just
Yeah,
something
yeah,
that feels like it could all fall down. But it's kind of just this kind of it's a leap of
yeah.
faith.
Literally, but faith, yes.
um, and with co-directing, now you actually do have something. You're not just hanging on one
Yeah,
end. Um, and I was really considering the co-direction due to deciding to act in
okay.
it as well.
Yeah.
So that was a motivating factor
Hmm.
as well to have this preordained team to be like ready, kind of, you know, have a bit more of a safety net, right?
Yeah. So like, what I'm curious, what are the inspirations for your films, the films you write? Because I mean, you're a writer,
Yeah.
and like, and was is your main inspiration from books, or are they from video games that you're currently like researching or whatnot, or is it very much like what you just casually live about life, and then something just pops up, and then just kind of
Right.
goes into your pen and paper?
Um, a lot of my inspirations are books that I read growing up,
Gotcha.
um, such as Shadow of the Wind or
Okay.
L'Ombre du Vent by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. It's a Spanish book, but I read it translated.
Okay.
I really, really love that book. There was La Chute by Camus. There was Dune by
Okay.
Frank Herbert. A
Yeah.
lot of these types of books that would really like get my mind going on like just how to structure something and
Mhm.
how there's a method
Mhm.
to it. Um, so that was a lot of inspiration. I've also obviously got a lot of film inspiration, a lot of
Mhm.
films I watched growing up. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy being a very beloved treasure in my childhood. Um, I've also read a lot of comic books that had a significant influence on my artistic taste. Like there
Mhm.
was, I read Neil Gaiman, who wrote a Sandman, who wrote Stardust, like some really, really interesting out there stuff that really like resonated with me because there was so much heart to it.
Mhm.
So, like reading a lot of comics, reading a lot of books, and then, movies, like just having a whole aesthetic that kind of permeates in your mind. Like when you imagine things, sometimes you imagine them
Mhm.
through the lens of having a camera
Mhm.
perspective. And so we have like even in our minds sometimes an imagination represented through a specific artistic medium. That's certainly had an impact on me as well. And like playing games too, everything contributes. Everything you do, everything you watch, everything
Yeah.
you live has an impact. Obviously, things that I've personally lived through
Mhm.
have influenced my worldview and thus my artistic
Mhm.
uh, taste.
Do
So,
do you prefer writing do you prefer playing one? Do you prefer playing heroes or villains? And how do you base your villains, or where do you base your villains
right.
off of? Is it like a bully from back in childhood that you despise, and you would create him as a villain to to kind of realistically destroy him, or is it more like an idea that you've found in a book that's like, oh, this is interesting. I don't know how I
Yeah.
feel about this, and then you would implement a character within that follows the idea.
So for the preference, I'll go against the grain here and say that sometimes there's something very beautiful in the struggle of a hero.
Hmm.
Like there's something that can be deceptively simple.
Hmm.
And it's also that often heroes are our protagonists,
Hmm.
and protagonists are kind of these vectors of empathy, right? They're like
Hmm.
the focal point towards which an audience will empathize with. And I think that's like the thing I'm the most excited about when I play part is like how to project and receive empathy,
Hmm.
like how to establish a bond in some capacity.
I have something that'll, I guess, contradict that.
Yeah,
I feel like every villain thinks they're the protagonist or they're the
yeah,
heroes. So
yeah,
like that's why like whenever I watch a film or I play a video game or whatnot, like every single character to them in their eyes, they're the hero. So
yeah,
like how do you kind of like justify where the line between hero and villain? You know what I mean? Because like ultimately
right,
speaking, it's very much a subjective thing. Like no matter how like even the heroes, for example, like Superman, you know,
sure.
arguably in some eyes, people see him as the biggest villain there is, seeing as all he does is just destruction everywhere, and he's an alien and all this fun stuff.
Well,
But even though he doesn't mean it, even doesn't mean it, you know what I mean? It's just like, it just
right,
happens
yeah,
because Zod comes in. Like we would never met Zod if you didn't come into Earth. You know what I mean? Types, you know. So
right.
what's your opinion on that?
So my opinion on that is that I mean, like I previously said, I differentiate necessarily hero and villain from protagonist, right?
Mm,
Protagonist is the character that we're following that pushes the plot forward, right?
mhm,
Sometimes our protagonist isn't heroic,
mhm,
so to speak, and that happens. I think that um, no matter what, that is what's interesting to me is a point of view character
mhm.
being like inherently connected to the audience.
Yeah.
So if you make your protagonist a villain, so to speak, that means that you're allowing the audience to sympathize and maybe empathize with someone that's probably not a great person. And so what are you saying by doing this,
Yeah.
right? that's where some works can be really interesting due to this. Like I could think of like Breaking Bad, for example.
Yeah.
And some works can be less great because of this, right? It makes you kind of fall into this kind of nihilistic, like, oh, everything's evil then,
Yeah.
where there's still something to be said about having heroes in our media.
Hmm.
And so I think that it's somewhat becoming an underrated opinion that classical heroes are pretty great in their own right. It's just that you have to humanize them the same way you humanize villains and make them so interesting by
Hmm.
giving them flaws.
Hmm.
I think flaws are terrific because they're ways that kind of you see the Achilles heel of the character. You see how they could fall, and so there's a tension there of like you set up that they're overly confident. Therefore, that could be their downfall easily at any point.
Hmm.
And so there's a tension that you don't know when the shoe will drop or if it does. And that's often what makes a lot of villains interesting. I think you could apply that same thing to heroes. Now, whether they're protagonists or not is like different, I would say.
Hmm.
That's just perspective of the
Yeah.
work. But I think that for the Superman case, I think Superman has often been very idealistic of a portrayal. So
Hmm.
when you make that less idealistic, it becomes less Superman to some extent.
Yeah.
And so I tend to quite like, for some specific cases, like Superman to be paragons, and I don't think that they have to be so morally gray.
Hmm.
I think that there are characters that are that character in particular is meant to be aspirational, right? Something
Hmm.
almost like a father figure of
Yeah.
sorts. Um, and I think that's something to be celebrated as well. I really like playing characters who have flaws, but that desperately want to do what's right,
Hmm.
despite right. So you often get, these a lot of Shakespearean characters that people love to play in theater.
Yeah.
It's because there's so much drama of, oh no, my life is inevitably gonna end in a terrible manner,
Yeah.
but I love this person, and it's like it's a
Yeah.
struggle between like a good side and a bad side, and
Yeah.
there's something nice about that balance, and that's what kind of makes a complex character.
Mm. I feel like my the thing is like whenever I watch or read like a comic book and I watch and I see the villains and the heroes or the protagonists themselves and when they interact, a lot of people gravitate towards the idealistic of aesthetic, specifically the aesthetic of a hero. So like the cape, the mask, the whole shebang, the pose, all of that stuff is like associated to what a hero looks like. You know what I mean? And so that's why like
Right.
people often prefer Batman because it's the complete opposite of what a
Yeah.
hero idealistically looks like. It's
Sure.
dark. He's
Yeah.
very, he looks like he actually looks like the villain in most cases. He's terrifying.
Right.
Everyone's afraid of him. So
Yeah.
that's why I like characters are more ambiguous and they're not straightforward good guy bad guy. Like I guess the only exemption, not even like even Captain America for example in the beginning, like I'm specific the MCU, not the comic book, but the
Sure.
MCU. In the beginning, he's very much a stick in the mud. You know what I mean? He's very, we gotta be patriotic and all this fun stuff. But then later on, when he enters the Civil War phase, is my favorite version of Captain America because that's when he actually is deemed the bad guy in Tony's eyes, for example. Because he,
Right.
he kind of like he was the best, he was his friend, and then he lied to him about something as serious as who killed his mother. But then you're like, oh damn, like whose side am I on now? You know what I mean? So that's why I like scripts like that with like complexity. There's not really a bad character, or at least
Right.
the bad guy perceives himself genuinely as the good guy, as doing something that's good. I feel like those type of stories gravitate more. I guess they have more. I don't know. There's more complexity, and it allows you to kind of think and reflect on the actual meaning of what is it to be good and what is it to be bad, and is it very much you know
Right.
obviously when
Um,
when the character blows up a whole freaking building, a bunch of people die. It's pretty straightforward that the person's not the best of characters. You know what I mean?
it probably somewhat on the evil scale,
Yeah. So like
somewhat.
exactly. So like when you the same thing with Wanda, for example, she did the same thing. She blew up her
Mm,
whole building and then killed a bunch of people,
yeah,
and that's what that initiated Civil War. But then she feels incredibly like bad about it. And she's like, "Oh my god,
yeah,
I should literally be locked up because of this." And people convince her like, "No, it was all an accident, all this stuff." So like that whole like thread of like, is she good? Is she bad? Who's the good guys? Who's the bad guys? It's like I feel
right,
like that's like the I guess the more interesting stories to follow than the he's a bad
sure.
guy, kill him or arrest him.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for having characters all around that feel true
Yeah.
to some extent, right? And I think to answer your question from earlier about how I conceive villains or
Mhm,
antagonists,
mhm,
um, it's often either when I encounter in real life something like I witness something, an idea that I find either like a perspective or an idea that I find like hard to reconcile, like
mhm,
something I'm like, ooh, I don't agree with that.
mhm,
I find this strange, and yet there are people who adhere to this idea.
mhm,
What does that mean
mhm,
that people like adhere to this? And so I try to usually make an antagonist or a villain part be someone that represents an idea,
okay.
right? And that's an idea that runs counter to our protagonist.
Mhm,
So it's a battle of ideas, right? And you have the side that whose perspective you are making us empathize with,
mhm,
your protagonist, and the antagonist is the opposition or what stands in the way of that,
mhm,
what force. And it doesn't have to be a direct thing, it could be like distance or the idea of like loss. It could be like antagonistic forces can be more abstract as well,
mhm,
but often a lot of audiences tend to respond to them when they're more concrete, right? um so it's having these forces interact, and from how they interact a message comes out.
mhm.
So that's often what's interesting, is having these characters that represent larger things.
Mm. So as a penultimate question, do you ever take characters from your D&D experiences as as a character in your script? I know, or vice versa. If you take in a character from one of your scripts and then implemented them in your D&D, because you're a DM. For
Yeah,
for those who don't know, he
yeah,
does he does DM for a couple of D&D games, notably the games that we're in, and arguably the characters that we've created are special, to say the
yeah,
least. And they
for
have
sure.
they have a lot of layers, and there's a lot of things that they do that may or may not be moral. So,
Right.
so do you ever, or have you ever taken a character from either a script or like I don't know, a book, a novel you're writing, whatever, and then put him into D&D, or vice versa?
I have adapted characters and concepts that I had for either a book or something that I'd done prior and try to reconfigure that idea. Sometimes I change the idea through the adaptation process.
Hmm.
Like I still view it as adaptation. Um, but sometimes the idea stays extremely similar and it's this thing transposed here
Hmm.
as a plot point or as a character that represents this in the story.
Hmm.
So yeah, I have. I
And,
have.
and, and have you ever tested out a script by using D&D?
Somewhat.
Okay,
Somewhat.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I have.
It's a good way. It's literally like
It's
an immersive film where you could play around with characters and whatnot.
yeah, it's I don't necessarily view it as testing, but more like adapting it into a different format to see
Sure.
if it works better in that format,
Sure.
or to see what that gives,
Yeah.
right? When you adapt it to the format of having players interact with it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when you feel strongly about an idea and a character, sometimes you want to see that character in a context where you're having players interact with them
Hmm.
and see what effect that has on their story.
Hmm. I mean, like there's a lot of like instances where you put in also because you mentioned how you like puzzles. You also you also implement a lot of puzzles
Yep.
into the games. Do you ever like do those puzzles come from puzzles that you've you know had to witness or actually go through yourself as like a moral dilemma or perhaps maybe something else, or are
Um,
they very much like, hey, let's just like flip a coin, look up something on Wikipedia, and like, oh, this is good.
um, I tend to come up with puzzles on my own, thinking of like, for example, experiences I've had in like games
Mhm.
where like, Zelda games have a lot of puzzles.
Yeah,
I try to think of them in a spatial capacity.
gotcha.
So, in a space, what kind of setup of a space can create an interesting puzzle? And so often it's just from like just coming up with it, just
Mhm.
through having inspiration from, games I've played, etc. And as you've mentioned, sometimes when it's more of a morality puzzle,
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes it's from being in a specific circumstance and thinking to myself, this is an interesting challenge for
Okay.
people to have to reconcile.
Yeah.
And so there's something interesting. Usually, for me, what makes a good puzzle
Yeah.
is a thematic link at the
Okay.
center.
Yeah. Yeah.
So by executing the puzzle, you're tackling an idea
Hmm.
the same way that like an antagonist is an idea.
Yeah.
So like you're getting a better understanding or a perspective on an idea, a theme, and to me that's often the best puzzles.
But how do you gauge complexity of puzzles? Because like obviously it's a lot harder for other people to maybe they don't think the same way or they don't ever think like that. So how do
Yeah.
you gauge the complexity of a puzzle and then implement it into a game? Because it has happened where she was like, oh damn, what do we do now?
Yeah. Gauging difficulty of puzzles is definitely something you could only learn after
You've done
administering a puzzle once at least. Um, because you have to kind of set your expectations to a correct level,
yeah.
but there is like a way to do it. It's like you can either provide multiple answers,
Hmm.
but they have to all be fitting. That's the problem with that, is that
Yeah.
if you have multiple answers, but one of them just
Makes no sense.
breaks
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
puzzle,
Yeah.
then it's like you have to make a call on that
Hmm.
if that's what you want. But if there's a way to break it in a way that still speaks to what the puzzle is about,
Hmm.
then that's great. If there's multiple exits, that's fantastic.
Hmm.
Um, but you have to do that consciously. Otherwise, sometimes you leave enough clues that they won't find all of the clues, but with enough of them, you can directly solve it, right?
Okay. Okay.
There's kind of a math to it where it's like if the answer is 5, if the room contains, 2 and then it contains 2 and it contains 1, let's
No,
say,
you leave a pattern essentially to
you
allow.
leave a pattern,
Yeah.
and people, human beings, are excellent at pattern recognition. That's something I've noticed. And so I'm quite proud to say that almost every single puzzle I've administered has been cleared in a way that I could foresee,
Mm,
in a
yeah.
way that made sense. Even if it wasn't like, let's say, the prime path through it,
Yeah.
it was a path that made sense.
Okay.
With, it allowed them to make it through.
Yeah.
So I don't think I've ever administered a puzzle that no one could solve. because
But
that's a bad puzzle, right?
have you ever administered a puzzle that could be solved through the skill level of particular characters? For example, like say one character in D&D specifically is like a barbarian, one's more of strength oriented, the other one's more, I guess, intelligence wisdom oriented, right? Or
Yeah.
charisma oriented, right? Do you ever administer a puzzle where the person who has the strength, who's strength oriented, can solve it through strength, and then that same puzzle could be solved through intelligence, charisma, and then
Yeah. Yeah,
what?
sometimes I do design puzzles specifically based on the setup of the characters that are entering the situation, right? Because
Gotcha.
you look at their kits, they
Uh-huh.
all have an arsenal at their disposition. So you have to check, is this something that they could use many times? Because if it's something they could only use once,
Yeah,
if they burn it out, are
it's
they
done.
stuck?
Yeah,
That's not good, right? You can't create something where like it's a box and you can't get out. So puzzles have to be thought of in a way that once the players figure it out, they can now use it to clear it. And if
gotcha.
there is like a expendable resource, then
Yeah,
there are alternate ways out,
okay.
right? Sometimes it's the idea that if you've used this at that time with, let's say, the mage character, an intelligence based character, then that can make you skip a whole portion.
Yeah,
If the team has worked together to figure that out early,
yeah,
then they get one exit.
yeah.
If it keeps going on and the barbarian finds a way to break a door down, if they figured that out in a way that thematically links once again to the puzzle, right, it comes from a place of teamwork and it comes from a place of understanding the troubles they're in,
Mhm,
then that's a viable exit for a puzzle.
mhm,
So yeah, I've had a bunch of puzzles where specifically using a combination of two characters or using a combination of one character's skill or another's,
mhm.
once they understand the box they're in, allows them to get out.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So as a final question, do you have any? Well, not much of a question, but it's more. Do you have any advice for someone that's either wants to go through a master's degree and doesn't really know if it's right for them? Maybe it's not. And also, as well as like someone who's as an aspiring filmmaker, any advice, or sorry, a storyteller specifically, because it could go through
Right.
different mediums. What is your advice to them in terms of like how to find inspiration, also how to structure their kind of
Yeah.
stories to make it
Yeah.
more coherent and I guess good from a teacher's perspective?
Sure. So for the first question, if people should try to engage with doing a master's, um, if you either care about school, if it's something you enjoy, if it's something that you have a genuine curiosity about a subject and you just feel the need to answer some sort of question you've had about it forever, and that it's not a question with a seemingly available answer, then that's a great way to go. Like the masters and continuing studies is kind of the endless pursuit of knowledge, right? So
Mm,
it's deciding I'm going to commit more time to this because I care to, either myself have more general knowledge or just to answer this one burning question, right? So for people who have this in mind, who see themselves in this, do it. Give it a shot. Um, Passion is half of the work. Passion is half of what you need. Um, Now, if you're less inclined to liking school, well, at the very least, I can say that the process of going through seminars and doing a master's is not the same as doing a bachelor's or going to high school. It feels far different. It feels like a different stage.
it's less meticulous, you say? It's like it's less, it's more of an I guess open and more a collaborative effort than
It's
it is.
more open for sure because you are deciding what path you're carving.
Mm,
You just have to make sure that you're rigorous, that you're focused, that you are, committed. But commitment is like the other half,
mhm,
passionate and committed. Um, and that's what you need. So if you feel that that's something you'd like, then yeah, I really recommend it. It's so stimulating mentally because you're going to
mm,
be interacting with a lot of super smart individuals, people that know a lot of things, but also a lot of people that are interested in genuinely learning things and communicating things. That it's a great place to stimulate yourself mentally. It's a great place to be.
mm,
Um, Now, I acknowledge that that's not for everyone, and a lot of people will, find their bag somewhere else, so to speak, and that is completely valid. And a lot of people will have gone through a lot of classes and just be kind of burnt out from school. That's
mhm,
super common, and yeah, it's not something to be looked down on either. It's
mm,
just a different path.
mm.
Um, Now, your last question on advice for storytellers out there. So the three act structure is quite famous. It's a great place to start. It's a great place to get an understanding of how a lot of people expect the story to go,
Mm,
right? When starting a story, a lot of people tend to gravitate towards stories that start in a gripping way
mm,
and end in a gripping way. So, how your beginning connects to that ending or to where it's going
mm,
is a lot of where the interest lies. It's a lot of there's kind of a math to it. So when you introduce something, you're warning the viewer that this will come back later, and you're paying that off. There's setup and payoff. That is an amazing concept to teach storytellers. Setup and payoff is everything that gives you a feeling of satisfaction throughout a story. Um, so use the medium that you love the most, that you feel comfortable with using, no matter what it is, to tell a story that you feel works well through that medium, right?
mm,
So if you're thinking about interaction, look at video games, look at tabletops. If you want to know what people think, you have access to a lot of that. But for inspiration, live life, have find your voice by often having a worldview. And that's just by living that we gain a worldview. So ultimately, just try to express something that you feel and that you don't think can be expressed just by saying one sentence, right?
mm,
So sometimes when you reach that epic feeling, like a lot of like fantasy is epic
mhm,
in the sense that you can't just put like one word or just like a sentence to describe what the feeling of reading or experiencing that work of art is.
mhm,
That's adventure. That's the epic, right? It's something that goes beyond. That's just the experience of having that adventure. So that's overall what I'd urge potential storytellers to think on.
Interesting. All right. Well, if you have anything to promote any projects you have going on, I don't know, books, films, whatever you want, a promote it now.
uh,
Um,
I'm still editing a film, so I can't talk about it too much. But once it releases, I'll be very excited
mm,
about it. Um, it's uh, it's kind of a film that will be the capstone of what I've learned through throughout going to film school and going out of film school. And so it's going to kind of be almost a graduation for me
Nice.
in some respects.
All right. Well, thanks, Phil, for being back on the podcast. Maybe again, maybe next year again. We'll see.
Right. Right. I'm a
uh,
busy man.
yeah. So, if you guys want to listen to us, we're now officially on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So you're welcome to listen to us. We'll be coming out. I think I'll release it 3 episodes at a time because now we're at, I think this is the 14th episode, so it's the final episode. It's the Christmas episode. Merry Christmas to all of you.
Yeah. Merry Christmas. Merry holidays.
and yeah, so probably probably coming out either next month. Yeah, it'll be coming out. This episode will be coming out the 25th, but then the actual like Spotify itself will be coming out the month after. So all right, see you guys next time. Merry Christmas, and see you guys next year. Peace.